Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to today's seminar. My name is Bart Gaans. I am a leading research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. China is often seen as a monolithic entity with a grand strategy to overthrow the hegemony of the US in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. And key in this grand strategy is the principle of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of other countries. China also has a no strings attached policy aiming to acquire influence in those countries. But does China actually really have such a monolithic state apparatus with a grand strategy? And to what extent are principles like non-intervention sustainable or even real? So today's main speaker will discuss these and other questions in his presentations. Tim Rühlig is a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and he's also an associate research fellow with FIIA's sister institute in Sweden, the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, or UI. Today's event also doubles as a book launch. Tim has recently published a book with Oxford University Press on China's foreign policy contradictions, lessons from China's responsibility to protect Hong Kong and WTO policy. So Tim will now present the main findings from that book for about 25-30 minutes, I believe. And this will then be followed by Elina Cinco's comments on Tim's presentation. After that, we'll then open the floor for questions and answers. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to Tim, please.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you so much, Bart. Thank you, FIIA as a whole. Thank you, Elina, for the very kind invitation. And thanks a lot, of course, for all of you for coming and showing interest in my book this morning at a time where I think Russia, NATO seem to catch all the attention. So I'm particularly grateful that we can still talk about China, an issue that I believe has quite a Russia angle as well, but that is actually something I've also left for the very end of my presentation in case I have a minute or two to reflect a bit on that. I should maybe say that this book has just been published indeed, as Bart mentioned, but it's based on my PhD research, so it is the result of several years of field research in China, where I had the pleasure to meet plenty of party state cadres, officials. Got a bit lucky. If you're interested, we can get a bit into how I had this opportunity and whom I actually had the chance to meet to discuss and sort of trace a couple of decisions, foreign policy decisions that have been taken in these three fields. The responsibility to protect Hong Kong and the WTO policy, to understand a little bit better by those examples how actually foreign policy is being done in China and what that implies for the international order. So to start with this, what I look at here is the era of Xi Jinping, also a bit before, but I have conducted all those interviews and discussions I had was all during the Xi Jinping era. And I think it is clearer than ever probably that Xi Jinping has made very clear that China has global ambitions. It's not just about domestic affairs. He keeps repeating that China's development can also offer lessons to the rest of the world, particularly developing countries, but not just them. And that China has also a couple of different ideas how to order the world. Now the question is, of course, what does that sort of imply? Is China sort of a global leader within the existing system? So is that primarily China being a power that wants to have more influence in the existing institutions, with the existing rules that we are all familiar with? Or is China rather challenging the international system? Has China fundamentally different ideas? Something that Xi Jinping, as just mentioned, keeps indicating. And if we look at the question, what could be sort of a germ from which a new China model arises, as it's very often framed in the academic literature, then this is maybe the return of the Westphalian world. China keeps repeating that state sovereignty, state control, non-interference is at the heart of how it sees international affairs, that it is about states, not civil society, that it's about states, not multinational companies, and international institutions, yes, but states should really have sort of still reserved the right to interpret and to shape those institutions. So that sort of leaves the question, what is then the role of the state in China's foreign policy? And with that also, how consistently is actually China implementing what it rhetorically claims to do? Let's consider the three cases that I look at. And they're sort of modeled after a tripartite definition of politics done by one of the old German political scientists, ordering politics into sort of three area fields, as he calls it: security, rule, and or authority, what Max Weber referred to as Herrschaft, and welfare. So in the security field, let's consider the responsibility to protect. This might be a concept that we've been discussing a couple of years ago, this idea that sovereignty is not just unconditioned, that states don't just possess sovereignty, but that there's actually a responsibility coming with that sovereignty, the responsibility to protect its own population from mass atrocities. Now, China has been very skeptical towards that norm from the outset, which is not surprising if you consider that China is always emphasizing state sovereignty. It may also not be surprising if you consider that mass atrocities might at some point be committed in China, or that human rights are already violated in China, so the skepticism may be sort of reasonable. But interesting, China has also never fully rejected that idea. And also in its implementation, China has been inconsistent, or as I call it in my book, contradictory. So in 2011, in the Libya war, when some NATO states plus some allies from the region bombarded Libya in reaction to Gaddafi's mass atrocities, China has been abstaining. It could have casted a veto in the Security Council, and just a few days before, there was even another resolution where China actually voted in favor to refer the case of Gaddafi to the International Criminal Court, a court that China has not even ratified its statute. So also quite remarkable. Why did China do this? And a couple of months later, from not, of course, the exact same context, but from a similar one, in the Syrian civil war, China was confronted also with references to the RTP in draft resolutions in the United Nations Security Council that did not mandate an intervention, but it reminded the Syrian government of its responsibility. So it sort of repeated the principle, but did not come with direct military interference. And China casted a veto. In fact, if you look at the vetoes China cast since it became the People's Republic, since it became the representative of China in the Security Council in the 70s, China has not cast on any single issue more vetoes in the Security Council than on preventing the RTP language in resolutions in the case of the Syrian civil war, even though they would have not been consequential or not momentous in that specific moment. Why is that? In the area field of authority or rule, China has accepted not many international treaties that would have any impact on the authority of its own state institutions and how they govern their own country. But one is the Sino-British Joint Declaration that China concluded in 1984, with the United Kingdom that guaranteed Hong Kong, that used to be a British Crown colony, a high degree of autonomy, as it's phrased in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. But it also stipulates that there is undivided sovereignty that China holds now over the former Crown colony. This, I think, in itself is remarkable, that China signed a treaty that said, well, you have full sovereignty, but you cannot actually fully exercise that sovereignty for the first 50 years after the handover, which was in 1997. And also here, and that was then enshrined in a principle that Deng Xiaoping had originally developed for Taiwan, the one country, two systems principle. So it would be one country, but Hong Kong would be very different. And again, in its implementation, China was a bit inconsistent. When it came to national security legislation, national security law that would protect China's interests, the interests of the own sovereign, that China was willing for many, many years, even though Hong Kong had an obligation to legislate such a law in Hong Kong, but China was actually willing to abstain from that and allow Hong Kong not to pass such a law. It was tried once in 2003, it failed, and it was never retabled again. And on the other hand, China had also promised Hong Kong the democratization of the election of the most important political post in the city, the chief executive. But despite this promise to Hong Kong, the Chinese government, I think, actually skipped over a number of compromise proposals that had been tabled before, so it fell short of fulfilling its promise here. So, in short, once more, China was willing to compromise on its sovereignty when it came to the national security law, but it was absolutely not willing to fulfill or to go for a compromise, even though it had promised one when it came to the democratization of the polity of Hong Kong. Well, of course, you all remember probably that in 2020, China imposed a national security law on Hong Kong. So if you like, I call this the resolve of this contradiction. So today, obviously, this is not, Hong Kong is not a case where we can look into the shades of gray anymore. Today it is very clear, but until 2019, if you like, I think the Hong Kong approach of China was also contradictory. And I look a bit into the book, why is it that Hong Kong is sort of the one of the three cases that got resolved? I think it's not a surprise. And let's consider the third and final field, the World Trade Organization, World Trade Law, and how China is implementing that. And there you can see that on a general account, you have characterizations that China has a high compliance ratio with the commitments it has made under the WTO when it exceeded. But you also have characterizations of China being a spoiler to the existing system. And I think, I don't have the time to sort of go into detail here, but I think there's a point in both of these characterizations. And if you then look at specific cases within that, or specific fields in that, you see that China has made quite far-reaching commitments to open up its banking sector, sector that is highly controlled by the state, that is of enormous importance for macroeconomic control for China, but it has not truly fulfilled its obligations. I speak here of paper compliance. So on paper it may look like compliance, but effectively it is not. And you also, at the same time, if you look at the dispute settlement bodies, so the judiciary of the WTO, you have a remarkably high compliance ratio of China when there are rulings against China, when the judiciary finds China violating WTO law. And interestingly, you have even reverse trends. So while China is gradually opening its banking market, its compliance ratio with the WTO dispute settlement body is decreasing. So the only constant that I find in those cases is contradiction. This is not to say there are only contradictory cases in China's foreign policy making, but I still think it's sort of worth looking into why this is the case. Now to the main findings. The first is from the interviews, from trying to sort of understand, map out sort of how did certain decisions were being taken in China. What I find is dynamics arising from an interesting duality. First, of course, a growing confidence in China's power and strength, particularly under Xi Jinping. This belief, but also already a bit before, I would say, since the financial crisis, actually. But then also a persistent acknowledgement that this strength is quite vulnerable, that China is still facing plenty of obstacles, particularly domestically, that the Chinese that sort of endanger the long-term stability of the Chinese Communist Party, and that the Chinese Communist Party needs to take into account, of course, in its domestic policy making, but also when it considers what to do internationally. And that sort of shift, and that leads me sort of to the second general finding, where I can see that a lot is being sort of discussed still on the legitimation of the Chinese Communist Party. And particularly two elements are of importance. Let me sort of do that maybe in reverse order from what I put here on the slide. Economic performance. So still the promise that the Chinese Communist Party's rule helps all of you to have a better, a more prosperous life, a better welfare. And that is in a situation where China is undergoing dramatic economic reform without going sort of into detail, sort of this long-held model, export-oriental model that very much competed on labor cost is not working to the same extent anymore, which is why China tries to move up the global value chain, tries to be more innovative, aims to strengthen domestic consumption and also more self-reliance with particular, of course, the dual circulation policy that Xi Jinping has introduced. But still, sort of, to what extent China would be outward-looking and trying to integrate in global markets, or to what extent it would sort of protect itself or pursue a self-reliance policy is still sort of contested within the Chinese party state. So it's about the right balance. All know sort of we need both. The question is sort of how to balance that. So there are some tensions in the question how to achieve this economic performance that can legitimize the Chinese Communist Party's rule. And a similar tension exists when it comes to the second source of legitimacy, which is national pride, which is also not new. This narrative that Mao Zedong has united the country after a century of humiliation, lots of turmoil, civil war, outside intervention into China. Deng Xiaoping made the population rich again, if you like, and then Xi Jinping is now leading them to global power again, this narrative. But the question again is sort of what does that imply? How do you sort of see this global power? And there's, again, two interpretations. One, very much focusing on reputation, so being seen as a global leader that other countries, that the international community looks up to. So that is very receptive of the outside world and how it perceives China, as well as sort of a second interpretation where it essentially says, well, we're strong again, so we can enforce our take on the rest of the world. We can just go forward with our interests. Now, I've already indicated that there are those tensions and they need to be somewhere, of course, in the Chinese party state, which leads me to the third finding. Yes, China as a centralized top-down state. This is, of course, correct. It's also correct that Xi Jinping is more powerful than his predecessors. We can debate whether he has reached really the power of Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping, but he is omnipresent when he actually decides something, when he puts a priority on something, then he has the power to enforce that. But he cannot sit with all the foreign policy decisions, and that's where China's party state is still more fragmented than we may sort of see from the outside. We have always the dual structure of party institutions and state institutions. I'm not questioning that the party is always more decisive than the state. I'm also not questioning that in many cases the same sort of position is being held by the very same person, the state position and the party position, but not always. And there are still sort of two parallel structures that of course function not identically. You also have an ongoing dynamic between the central authorities and the local authorities, something that I will tap into in a minute, which is why I'm sort of skipping over this for the moment. You have different ministries and agencies, just like in many other countries, of course. You have state-owned enterprises, but also privately owned enterprises, so entrepreneurs with very close connections to the party state. I speak here of red capitalists, not a term that I've invented, but sort of invented. So, but sort of you have also very vital economic interests playing into foreign policy making. And interestingly, sort of this diverse set of institutions, they have divergent material interests. Material interests, I'm referring here to monetary interests, very often connected to corruption, but also material in the sense of power interests, but also different understandings of how to legitimize CCP rule. Now, even though I am quite advanced on time, so I'm running a bit short, let me introduce you a couple of quotes, because so far I've just presented that to you and sort of asked you to believe me. So maybe I give you a few quotes from interviews to illustrate this last point with the fragmented party state, particularly here the role of local authorities. And one local party official in the context of implementation of WTO law, opening up the economy, told me, and I quote here, "My duty as a local party official is to serve my county, not to adhere to some abstract rules hammered out by Beijing with foreigners at the WTO. This is what the people expect, otherwise they will protest. And nobody in Beijing wants to see social unrest." So he makes very clear it's not his primary goal to just implement what he gets from Beijing, and even Beijing itself has an interest that local party officials sort of adapt that to the local conditions and in some cases just sort of skip over commitments that Beijing has made. I skipped the second quote. It essentially says, well, but if the central leadership is sort of united on something, then of course it is hard for local party state officials to go against this. And I rather sort of read out one other quote from you, where I had a conversation with another official where I asked, "You mentioned that your hometown owns state-owned enterprises in other parts of the country which are hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers away. Why is that the case?" And sort of the underlying argument was here, of course, my question was, well, I can understand that a city would have its own companies because it creates employment, it employs people at home, but why on the other side of the country? And he laughed and said, "Yes, you're certainly right, but the party official wants to go on vacation in the beautiful parts of our country, so they go to visit the city-owned companies when they want to go on vacations, and the company pays for it." And I asked, can't they afford to travel? And he said, well, they can, but maybe not the five-star hotel with a pool and everything. And I should maybe add, maybe they can afford this, but of course it is comfortable if you don't have to pay for yourself. So there's also just material self-interest. I don't know whether that qualifies as corruption here, but certainly sort of not a very positive or altruistic motive. Now, this may all be interesting, but why do we need to care here in Helsinki this morning about all these, what is going on sort of within the party state? And I'd say that I think from these findings, 1 to 3, we find that that sort of shape what how China wants to react and how it is sort of exercising foreign policy. And this is primarily, I think, by two what I call modes of action: an instrumental approach to law and a redefinition of vocabulary. And what I mean by that is essentially that China tries to remain as flexible as possible in its foreign policy. That means It searches for arrangement where law doesn't constrain powerful states like China itself, but where law rather becomes a means of power. To some extent, this is of course always the case. Someone has made that law, someone is implementing that law. But I think there is sort of at least a gradual, if not a fundamental difference in China's perception of what the function of law should be. And redefinition of vocabulary, I think, is even more present. This is essentially sort of undercutting existing definitions, trying to question whether there's one definition of free trade in the world, questioning whether there's one right understanding of the rule of law, of democracy, of human rights, etc. You name it. So, and all this is essentially to be as flexible as possible, that whenever it needs to sort of consider what is happening internally, be that concern about the own vulnerabilities, be that sort of concern about the legitimation of CCP rule, or be it just vested interests within its own country that, say, from local party officials or from some agencies within the country, that China can always sort of have a response to that it is flexible enough to implement very different policies there. Where does this leave us? Well, certainly this is not a grand strategy. This is not sort of an overarching vision, as William Callahan has once put it, to order the world symbolically. This is, but this is still impactful. It is not, China is not coming with sort of an idea that could replace existing institutions, existing rules, existing trust, but it is undermining existing institutions, existing trust, existing rules and practices. Because precisely because it questions vocabulary, so it questions sort of the language we use, it questions the legal instruments we use, and thereby, of course, there's also an erosion of those institutions. So while China isn't constructing anything new here, but it is at least harming the existing. And even more so, I think, what brings that is if those institutions are being weakened, what is then getting more decisive are essentially power differentials. So it's more the question of sort of who can push through his own or her own interpretation, who can push through own interests. So power that has always, of course, been important becomes even sort of more predominant than before. Now, let me sort of say, because some readers of my book have sort of felt that I have a quite positive message to tell in saying that China is quite vulnerable, is not as strong as we tend to believe, even though I would still acknowledge China's strength is of course rapidly rising, but and sort of see that as a positive message. And I think that's a false conclusion. That's not what I'm trying to say here. To some extent, I think we are even worse off with a vulnerable China than we would be with a self-confident China, because China is inward-looking. It is carefully considering its options, the limits of its options. And if China was playing exclusively a game of international affairs, we would have sort of much more influence on China's thinking and considerations of what's happening out there in the world that we are part of. And of course, we may have some impact in what's happening domestically, but far less than if this was about the international arena. Now, I take maybe 2-3 more minutes to go a bit beyond the book and ask, can that help us in any way understand what's happening with China in Russia's war here? Is that helping us at all? And behind that question is, of course, also, hasn't Xi Jinping just consolidated its power in the last few years so much that all the diversity that I'm speaking of, or that all the sense of vulnerability is gone, and it's all about a confident China preceded by an all-powerful Xi Jinping? And I think there are still at least signs, even though, of course, I haven't sort of investigated that to the same extent as the cases that I've presented, that what I presented to you still helps us understanding sort of a bit the dynamics of China's reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine. In the first few days, I think it was interesting to see that China sent quite mixed signals. Apparently, it did know something would be happening with Russia and Ukraine, but apparently also it didn't expect the scenario that we actually saw. It didn't expect the war to last that long. It also may have not expected even a full invasion, maybe only a partial invasion of Ukraine. And I think what you could also see is that China was, of course, considering geopolitical interests and this sort of nationalist approach to it that comes with it, but of course also economic interests and technological interests. And to some extent, I think that duality still exists. If you just look at the narrative of what sort of comes out from press conferences of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or other actors, you could think, well, it's just about geopolitics. China has completely taken side with Russia. Also, if you consider that China is essentially repeating Russian propaganda, you could say China has fallen sort of completely on Russia's side. But if you then also look at the behavior of state-owned actors, economic actors, you find they're not actively undercutting the sanction regime put in place by the West. So they're still concerned about potential secondary sanctions against China. There's still concern about economic interests and technology. And I think that sort of distinction in the first days made China quite passive and, of course, that thereby tolerating very much what Russia was doing. Now sort of we see more of a premise of geopolitical calculations, but as I just said, I think the duality is still somehow there. And of course, it would be a question of strategy that we may or may not discuss in the Q&A at what point or were there any sort of red lines for the West to signal to China that if you cross that red line, there would be secondary sanctions that may sort of put a new dynamic in place. Of course, Russia's war also raises the question what price authoritarian leaders are willing to pay. We have been characterizing Putin very often as irrational. Could something similar happen with Xi Jinping? Would he be willing to pay an economic price? But I think that emphasizes even more that we need to get as much of sort of a grasp of what's happening inside China to try and understand the discussions and the calculations there. Also, if you look at the rhetoric, I think you can see stuff from what I've just presented, an emphasis on territorial integrity and the UN Charter, but also mixed with sort of a caveat saying, well, there's also regional security, NATO enlargement to the east has also brought up security concerns for the Russians. So once again, you can see that China is not sort of consistently referring to the principle of territorial integrity, but also coming sort of with some, if you like, footnotes, but decisive footnotes, saying, well, there may be cases in which that is different. So once again, sort of undermining sort of our understanding that China would, without doubt, stand to the principle of non-interference and sovereignty. Of course, we see shifts. I think we do see the dual circulation, maybe not full decoupling, but disentanglement. I also think that this will speed up after the Russia war, not least to give more leeway to China in its Taiwan policy. So of course, I see shifts within the different sources of legitimation or within the fragmented character of the party state. It's not static. You see waves where different sources of legitimation get more important. We see that the centralization continues. 5 years ago, I was much more confident that Xi Jinping would not be able to place all its allies in the Politburo and the Central Committee. This year, I'm much more pessimistic. I don't really see where the opposition could come from. So we do see those dynamics at play, but I still think that sort of these tensions or these dynamics still exist, even though not in a static way. Thank you so much for your attention, and in case any of you considers buying this book, if you get to the website of Oxford University Press and use that code, you'll get a 30% discount. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this very rich and also very clear overview of certain contradictions and inconsistencies in China's foreign policy. And I think now that all eyes are on Ukraine, it's certainly worth asking the question if China itself doesn't see a contradiction between its emphasizing non-interference on the one hand, or non-interference as a building block of international order on the one hand, and then at the same time failing to criticize or condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. But perhaps that's a topic that we can also come back to later in the discussion. Now I suggest we move on to FIIA's very own Elina Cinco, Senior Research Fellow, for her comments and questions. Okay, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Elina Sinkkonen, and I would like to thank Tim warmly for coming to Helsinki and writing this exciting and very timely book. And as was mentioned, the fieldwork material was collected in 2016, but not many of us have any more recent fieldwork material from China because the COVID times have really made it difficult to collect and conduct interviews in China, and it's quite difficult for all the researchers. So actually also the interviews are quite most recent that we can get. Yes, so I would maybe, my comments and questions to Tim are more kind of trying to contextualize the findings and the general theme as well. I'm starting with my first point concerning a part that Tim didn't discuss so much in his presentation, because probably most of you still haven't had the chance to read the book. I read it online, it's available there. We were really hard trying to get a physical copy here, but I guess there are still some shortages of paper, or it's still two reasons that we did not manage to get you a physical copy.
It's sold out at the moment.
Oh, it's sold out. Okay. Anyways, it would be nice to circulate a copy in this seminar, but unfortunately we are unable to do that right now. But the first chapter in the book starts by explaining the rationale of looking at the domestic context and foreign policy contradictions. And while I was reading this justification for these three cases, the importance to understand the domestic context of Chinese foreign policy making in order to understand Chinese foreign policy, it sounded really familiar to me as a China scholar. I think many China scholars have made a similar argument. I was studying national identity construction in my own doctoral dissertation, and I had a pretty similar kind of point that the subnational perspective, the domestic context, is really important to take into account when we try to understand China's foreign policy behavior. But there is always the tension between the area studies perspective and then the general international relations scholarship, which was also discussed in this first chapter. And now that China is becoming more important, and also people without area studies background are commenting China and China's behavior quite a lot, I think it's important for us from the scholarly perspective to try to somehow bridge this gap, since it seems to be really a decades long, and in forthcoming theses, people will probably still make the same point that the domestic context shouldn't be ignored, and it still kind of is. So My doctoral dissertation started with a quote from Joseph Fewsmith and Stanley Rosen for 2001, and they wrote already then that discussions of Chinese foreign policy decisions rarely take into account in a more than a cursory fashion the domestic context in which these decisions are made, yet that context is important for understanding Chinese foreign policy. So what should we do to better integrate the subnational perspective into general international relations theories? And should the area studies people cooperate more together, do comparative research, or publish in IR journals? Of course, the book itself is kind of a contribution in this regard to bring out some of the nuances in the discussion, but we have some Russia scholars here in this room, and they would probably also make the same comment. So I guess this is a kind of a more general problem in the social sciences scholarship. What wasn't in the beginning chapter, and something that I have found useful in my own work, is some analysis from, for instance, political psychology, where the scholarship does make the point that we have a general tendency to see a grand strategy when we are looking at behavior of other countries, but we do see the nuances, the fragmentations, and the contradictions when we are analyzing the foreign policy of our own country, which we know much better. So that can be applied to different contexts, and it also applies to China. So kind of the so what question, what about the contradictions if they apply basically to everybody? How should we improve the research agenda on a more broader terms to get over this continuous problem? Then I would perhaps like if Tim could discuss a bit more about the hierarchy of issues and kind of contextualize the contradictions with those policies that actually have more continuation. Because as was mentioned in the presentation and as is mentioned in the book, it's not all about contradictions. So there is, of course, the concept of Chinese core interests. There has been rather consistent policy towards Taiwan independence. In 2010, the core interest discussion brought in the concept of Chinese, the nature of Chinese political system as being one of those. So kind of how to situate the cases selected for the book when it comes to these other policy fields. Of course, there are different sort of linkages with the domestic context, but still, I guess you could say that there is more continuation in some policy fields than in others. And also, the level of fragmentation of the system varies across time, and this has been discussed in the area studies literature. So if you could say something about that, since that is important. You write that the duality of centralization and decentralization is the characteristics of the Chinese system, not a temporary phenomenon. And it's not going to go anywhere, even though power concentration has increased during President Xi's time. But it still hasn't been the same during different decades. So Hu Jintao period, for instance, was characterized as more sort of consultative, and also the bodies in the actual governance system have changed somewhat during different regimes. So this might also play a role in the bigger picture. Then, of course, if we concentrate on contradictions and, well, take the two things mentioned for the legitimation of the Communist Party, the economic growth factor and then the nationalism or national pride factor into account. While these are important, they are not really giving any clear answers to specific situations. So when it comes to trying to predict or understand China's behavior, are we kind of completely clueless if there are kind of a lot of contradictions? So how should we try to, perhaps because we need to try to estimate or predict sometimes what China is likely to do, and to be better able to try to affect that those policies as well. How should we approach this issue? The fragmented nature, of course, brings limitations, and as was mentioned, a stronger China might be an easier one to deal with, because then we would have a better understanding what China actually wants, but kind of how to deal with this issue. And then finally, this is maybe a bit too broad question to go into a lot of detail in here, but I was just wondering, because you discuss Chinese foreign policies partly in as part of the international system, and you are concentrating on the Chinese side and Chinese interest and China's behavior. But what about the nature of the international system? Because it's, of course, there are two sides on the same coin. The nature and fragmentation of the international system varies, of course, across different sectors. And there is various degrees of coherence of norms, and these are also a factor when you look at what happens to the international system in the future, and what is the future of international liberal order. So I would point out that it's not just what China does or does not do, it's also the nature of the norms, how coherent they are, what kind of consequences are there for the actor if they don't follow the norm, and what kind of space is left by the other big players in the field, like the behavior of United States, for instance. Because if there is more space left, then of course it's easier even for a fragmented China to take more powerful position in the system. So that would be my final point. Yeah, I guess it's easier based on the presentation than for the audience to ask more questions about the empirical cases, because those were pretty clearly presented during Tim's presentation. Thank you so much. I will end here.
Thank you, Elina. Tim, would you like to reply to some of these questions and comments?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for your very careful reading of the book, and I think you have very good points. And I should maybe say, to start with, yes, indeed, sort of the argument that we need to take into consideration more the subnational is, of course, nothing I invent myself here new. This case has been made many times with regard to China studies. I'd even say plenty of what I say is probably not just limited to the experiences we would have with Chinese foreign policy making. If you like, the book may also find, like other works, that some of the dynamics that we observe we are very well familiar with, also from Western countries, from democracies, or from countries, from other authoritarian regimes, if we study them. So certainly, sort of, as such, this is not exceptional. And of course, I should also sort of say here, or maybe I should have started with this in my presentation, that the Chinese system is
I think, quite opaque, and as such, this study is just one contribution among many and cannot answer everything here, obviously, and it's not making that claim. Hopefully, it's just adding sort of one piece to us understanding a bit better what's happening there. To what extent should IR scholars integrate the subnational perspective? I mean, I'll certainly subscribe to that. I think only after I'd handed in the PhD, I realized that I was probably considered now an area studies specialist. So started as an IR scholar, I think, and then so wherever you want to place me now, I guess sort of that may have at least been a personal journey that sort of incorporates that, and maybe sort of considering the subnational perspective has maybe to some extent made me being considered an area specialist. I'm still sort of hesitant to say this.
Well, I have a similar experience.
Yeah.
Tends to happen.
Yeah. The political psychology literature that you refer to is very interesting. I must admit, I haven't read this argument, but I think it's a very interesting one that I would love to look into, not least because my feeling is that this is precisely what's happening at the moment in large parts of the Western political discussion, not academic discussion, but political discussion, that at least I can tell from a discussion I had just the day before yesterday in the German parliament, that spokespeople of several parties from the parliament there who deal with questions of Germany's China policy for quite a while have been united in essentially saying, well, we see that Russia apparently thinks very differently, so probably China also thinks very differently. And with sort of, and that of course is sort of coming with this underlying thinking that probably they have a grand strategy, they have a grand plan, we haven't sort of fully understood that yet. We need to understand it now in order to sort of save our democracies. And while I do think that of course we need to very carefully consider China's policies, we of course agree that we shouldn't just take for granted our democracies and that we need to defend the freedom we have here and elsewhere in the world. I still have an issue with sort of that sort of framing that probably they have a grand strategy and a plan and we just haven't sort of understood this. I think so. In that sense, that very much mirrors essentially what you rephrased from that political psychology literature. Now to the more challenging questions that you raised. Not all is about contradiction. Indeed, not everything is about contradiction. I guess I mean, it is always sort of helpful the more cases you have and sort of more representative. I think what I wanted to understand here is looking at the role of state control or state sovereignty. I observed those sort of tensions, and maybe I was coming from a similar question that I've just rephrased from those German politicians, but maybe with a question mark and not with an exclamation mark, where I thought, well, is it just me not understanding the logic behind this, or is this inconsistent? And if that is the question, then of course you don't look at those cases that are quite consistent. But then, because that at least you feel that you understand, maybe you're even wrong with understanding why China is doing what it's doing. But since you have to start and to stop somewhere, I guess that's why I started with those that I found more puzzling from my perspective. Would I pick the same case studies if I restarted that same project today? No. I should maybe say yes to try to sell the book, but the truth is no. I think this is one of the weaknesses of this book, that maybe the cases may be a bit too traditional, or sort of go back to decisions that are relatively old, even though sort of I still think that the thinking of that is relevant to some extent. But if I pick today, probably look into technology questions, I would also consider That was actually, the second was something that I did have in mind, also look into fields where there's less rules and sort of less established institutions, so where there's more room for China actually to construct its own approach, to shape its own approach, where it is not so much responding to existing institutions and discourses. I'd also, of course, look into questions of infrastructure, BRI. So, yes, so other cases could have certainly been picked. I think they were sort of, I selected them from this perspective of trying to understand contradictions that I saw, and then sort of trying to conceptualize a bit different area fields of politics and sort of see, is this contradiction just happening in the economic realm or just in the security realm? Or so I tried to sort of have a quite broad selection. Fragmentation varies, the level of fragmentation varies. Yes, I would claim that I reflect upon this to some extent in the book, particularly in chapter 2, where I sort of try to historically trace the sort of roots of centralization and decentralization trends in China. We try to explain where does this historically come from, and where I'd always say, well, the legacy of different historical sort of influences still persists in some way, but there's always a dynamic involved here. So I agree with that. If the question is what makes me sort of certain that it's still at play, to some extent, of course, sort of the empirical results that I have in the case studies. To another extent, at a second point, I think also if I look at the country, how diverse it is, how large it is, how it functions. I mean, so I think there would be an extremely long way to really get rid of that fragmentation. Also, hard to give any other example. That circles back to something I said in the beginning in response to your comments. I think there's hardly any country, or maybe no country, that does not deal with some sort of fragmentation here. It's just that for some reason we look at Chinese statements. The system is opaque, and then also the Chinese want us to believe that, of course, everything is sort of consistent, and there is the great leader, the helmsman that's leading the way forward. But maybe we shouldn't always buy into that. Sort of, it's maybe just sort of questioning that exceptionalism narrative from China itself. Divergent system characteristics, yes, true. I guess that is a limitation to some extent. I very much sort of look inwards into China, what's happening in China, the dynamics in China. It's of course also responding to the situation it faces. I'd still say, well, at least to the extent that I say something about my case studies that are different, if you like, you see those different considerations in all of them playing out, but of course in the conditions vary, so also probably China's responses vary. And finally, the specific predictions. Well, this is something, of course, I'm struggling with now that I've moved more from the academic world to more the think tank world, with sort of specific conclusions and predictions can we draw from this. It is certainly not sort of the ambition of this book to say, all right, and now I explain to you what's going to happen with Russia tomorrow or with another field tomorrow. So I will not give you sort of a satisfying reply here. It is true that this is more sort of setting the groundwork upon which sort of the criteria, if you like, or a framework against which you then need to consider specific cases. I would sort of still, if you approach it, I'd still sort of try to take it more from the fragmented institutions than from the different sources of legitimacy, because they indeed just sort of provide a general framework. But then the question is still difficult to answer. I understand this, but is more, I think, who are the actors involved in that, and what is most likely their stance towards sort of those more structural conditions. But that I understand if you find this not a satisfying reply. And
I don't think there is really an easy answer to that question. Thank you very much.
so much.
Thanks, Tim, for these responses to Elena's feedback. And thanks also for being a little bit self-critical. That's something that happens all too rarely in the academic world. Okay, it's now high time to close the seminar. I would like to thank Tim very much for presenting the main findings of your book today. Elena, thank you as well for your comments. Everybody here in the audience, thanks for joining us today, and let's finish with a round of applause.